Hello and welcome to our Research Like a Pro question and answer series. Today we're talking about direct, indirect, or negative evidence. And this was a great question that was submitted during our Research Like a Pro study group and during the assignment to analyze your current sources to see what kind of evidence you have and analyze your sources and information. So the question focuses on a really cool document called the Reconstruction Oath and Return of Voters. And this is from Georgia. And during the Reconstruction after the Civil War, um, people who wanted to vote had to go register and they had to show they were qualified. So this collection is on Ancestry. It's called Georgia U.S. Returns of Qualified Voters and Reconstruction Oath Books from 1867 to 1869, and it's from Forsyth County and 39th Precinct, page 31. And this is a great citation written by one of the members of our study group. Good job. So the question is, this record is from Forsyth County, Georgia, and is the index of my ancestor, George W. West, 1867 Reconstruction Oath. They had to sign this oath to become U.S. citizens again after the Civil War. This record is the index that shows you what page their oath is on and also provides some geographic info. The record keeper was only supposed to note in the index if and how long the person lived in the state, county, and voting precinct for the past 12 months. However, this record keeper got it wonderfully wrong and asked how long my ancestor, George West, had lived in these places. My ancestor said he'd lived in the state for 15 years, but the county and precinct for only 14 years. And isn't it wonderful when you get a little more information than you were expecting? That's great. Okay, I'm trying to analyze the evidence for his 1852 residence. That's his missing year when he's moved from South Carolina to Georgia, but hasn't yet settled in Forsyth County, Georgia, where he settled for the rest of his life. The question is this negative evidence that he lived in Forsyth County in 1852, or is it indirect evidence that he didn't live in Forsyth County in 1852? Is it both? Neither? I'd love to wrap my mind around this. However, I think I came to the ultimate conclusion, which is that the man says he didn't live in that county precinct in 1852, no matter what type of evidence the evidence is. I love this question because it's such a common thing to wonder what type of evidence these kind of things are. And so it's really good to dive into the details and figure this out. And I love that the answer is kind of here. Um, the man says he didn't live in that county precinct in 1852. So that kind of directly answers the question, right? So my answer is that this is direct evidence, but we should go through all the different ideas as well. So negative evidence is tricky because there's different ways to think about the word negative. And I think these definitions of negative can help us kind of sort it out. So when you think of negative evidence, we're looking at the definition of the word negative that falls into the adjective category and consisting in or characterized by the absence rather than the presence of distinguishing features. But a lot of the time we think of a negative as a no or a refusal, a denial, kind of like these nouns here. She replied in the negative, or even this exclamation, no, used in the military context. Negative, she's running like clockwork. So if we get those two mixed up, then it can be tricky to think of negative evidence because sometimes the answer to our research question is no. So does that make it then negative evidence? And no, it doesn't. So we need to look at that more and examine it closer. In negative evidence, we're looking for the absence of something that's expected. So to remind us, the evidence types are direct, indirect, and negative. Direct evidence is where the information provides an explicit answer to the research question. The information is relevant to the question and directly answers it. Indirect evidence is when the information does not explicitly answer the question, but can be combined with other information to build a case. And negative is the absence of information that was expected, like an extant record that does not contain information that might be expected to be there. Let's look closely at this return of voters. So on July 8th, 1867, George West was found on Oath Book A, page 447. His color was white, And the time of his residence in the state was 15, and you can see the ditto marks going back to years, 14 years in the county and 14 years in the precinct. So we do have some great information here about his residence. So to turn that information into evidence, we need to apply a research question. And our research question is, where did George West live in 1852? Did he live in Forsyth County? So from this record, we get some information and pulled it into a transcription here. The name of the voter is George West. And here's the relevant information. Now, is the place where he resided relevant to the question of where he lived in 1852? So 15 years prior to 1867 would have been 1852, and it's saying that he lived in the state of Georgia 15 years ago in 1852. So that is relevant. It explicitly answers our question. It says where he lived, and he lived in Georgia. Now, the next question is, did he live in this county? And it says he lived in this county 14 years ago. And so he lived in the county of Forsyth in 1853, but not 1852, and in the precinct as well. So we have to ask the question of the record. Did George live in Forsyth County in 1852? The record says no. He only started living there 14 years ago in 1853. So this information explicitly answers our question. It's directly relevant to where he lived in 1852. So I would call this direct evidence. Now, what's tricky is that direct evidence doesn't mean a complete answer. And so it doesn't give us the exact county he lived in. And the answer was also no, that he did not live in Forsyth County. So I can see why that would seem like negative evidence. But because we're looking for the absence of information and not for a direct answer, this is still direct evidence. So let's go through these. The information directly addresses the research question about where George lived in 1852, and it says he did not live in Forsyth. Direct evidence does not have to give a complete answer to the question, it just has to answer it directly. Where did he live in 1852? In Georgia and not in Forsyth County. Did he live in Forsyth? No, not in 1852. If the answer to the research question is no, that doesn't make the evidence negative. It just means that he didn't live there, and that's the answer to the question. Now let's do an example of negative evidence using the same document with the hypothetical brother of George, who I made up, Joseph West. Let's say our research question was to find out, was George's brother Joseph West a qualified voter in Georgia in 1867? Let's say that we found Joseph paying taxes in Forsyth County from 1855 to 1871, but then we didn't find Joseph listed on the Forsyth County return of qualified voters in 1867. The absence of Joseph from that record gives us negative evidence. It's telling us something. Perhaps he didn't sign the oath. Maybe he wasn't qualified in some way. How can we know? Well, negative evidence is a type of indirect evidence, and we have to combine that with more evidence and information to help us come to a conclusion. The historical background from the ancestry collection page for the qualified voters return says that the Reconstruction Acts of 1867 required Southern states to ratify the 14th Amendment, draft new state constitutions, and register voters, both black and white. In order to vote, men had to swear an oath of allegiance to the United States, and some were disqualified for their participation in Confederate government posts. Now that we know that, the absence of Joseph from this return of qualified voters, despite the fact that we found him on tax records during that time, could mean that he was not qualified, perhaps due to his participation in Confederate government posts. Given this is a made-up hypothetical person, we're not saying anything here, but if this were true, then this would be negative evidence. So that's what we're looking for when we're thinking about negative evidence, the fact that something's missing, the absence of a situation that's expected. Now, for our example number 2 of negative evidence, let's say we had a different research question. When did this hypothetical Joseph West, brother of George, die? So let's change our facts. So let's say we only had information that he paid his taxes until 1866 in Forsyth, and then he didn't pay taxes or vote in 1867 forward. That's negative evidence because he's not listed on that qualified voters registry. The fact that something is missing is a clue. So his name is missing from that record, and then it gives us evidence that he could have died before 1867, the absence of that expected situation. Now, what about indirect evidence? The research question, where did George West get married? Let's say our research subject was married by 1870. Again, this is all hypothetical. And perhaps in 1870, he was listed in the same household with this wife, and they had a 5-year-old child in the house. And then they were both single in 1860. His hypothesized wife was single in 1860, living with parents in Forsyth. And then we found this return of qualified voters saying George lived in Forsyth since 1853. Now we could make a case that perhaps they did get married in that same county since they were all living there that whole time. But it's still indirect evidence because the record doesn't say, where did you get married? And he doesn't answer that question. The record doesn't have anything that directly answers a question of where someone got married. It just says where he resided. So we would be taking a clue from there and combining it with other clues to build a case that he was married in Forsyth. But he could have been married in another state. Who knows? We don't have direct evidence answering the question. We can only just build a case with this clue. And that is how you would use indirect evidence. So going back to our original question, the voter's return does give us direct evidence that he lived in Georgia in 1852 and did not live in Forsyth County. So we do have direct evidence from that record. And what a cool record that was. And what a great question. All right. Thank you.